Thank you all again for having me here this weekend, this Sunday. So the way Nate described this is an opportunity for us all to gather and for me to share a little bit more about this tradition that I am marshal in this conversation of sort of how we confront, how we encounter a technology like artificial intelligence, and then open it up for an opportunity for us to discuss together what it all means and how it's landing with you. So my plan was to speak for probably about 20 minutes, giving a kind of overview of the Transcendentalists and their relation to these topics that we're discussing today, and specifically today in your Faith and Technology series, and then open it up for some discussion in terms of how this is helping to shape your thinking on artificial intelligence. So, Nate mentioned that I'm a research associate at the Center for the Study of World Religions at the Harvard Divinity School, and I'm going to do my best to keep this from going to sleep. And this year at the center, we call it the CSWR, we've begun this new research initiative on Transcendentalism. So today I'm going to share a little bit about that tradition, as I've said, as well as move into talking about its primary application of thinking about something like about artificial intelligence. So, Transcendentalism was, and I go to the second slide here, Transcendentalism was a 19th century American intellectual movement whose four distinct domains, religion, literature, philosophy, and politics, were nevertheless deeply intertwined. So too, its distinctive figures are bound together by sort of complex and sometimes fractious associations. So this makes Transcendentalism hard to define if you're at all familiar with this movement. But it began, as many intellectual movements do, as a sort of gathering of friends. You will probably be familiar with a number of them. But the first one I want to talk about was maybe someone you're not so familiar with, Frederick Henry Hedge, who wrote to Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1836, and he proposed a meeting, quote, annual or oftener if possible, of certain like-minded persons for the free discussion of theological or moral subjects. Invitations for this meeting generally went to Unitarian ministers. Hedge himself was a Unitarian minister up in Bangor, in Maine. Or in Emerson's case, ex-ministers. In 1832, he left his pastorate, left the Unitarian Church, but the aim was to discuss the direction of recent intellectual currents and what path they were sending the Unitarian Church down. So as the liberal wing of New England Congregationalism, Unitarianism was a 19th century, or in the early 19th century, had consolidated around a view of Christ, not as co-equal with God, but as humanity's sort of supreme moral exemplar, humanity's model, right? But the balance that Unitarianism sought to hold between Enlightenment rationality, which had emerged 150 years or so earlier, and biblical revelation, the biblical witness, it was challenging to hold these things in balance, right? The Enlightenment emerged to say human rationality, reason, we're only accountable to reason's claims, right? Biblical revelation, of course, says otherwise. It's the basis of what's on the text on the page and the ways the tradition has been passed down. You know, you can think of all sorts of instances where this sort of, these two competing forms of rationality might come into conflict with one another. The sun stands still in the book of Joshua, right? Whereas, on the other hand, reason would say, there's no basis for believing this would ever happen, okay? So, elsewhere, in the 1820s and 30s, The revivalism of the Second Great Awakening was reshaping, and we'll get a picture of the Second Great Awakening here in a second. It was reshaping American Protestantism, especially in the South and Midwest. Okay? So rapid demographic shifts, such as westward migration in the United States, were unsettling the religious status quo. New England, however, wasn't experiencing a lot of the revivalist fervor. What it was doing, in fact, was incubating its own religious transformation in those discussions, in those spaces, in the 1820s and 1830s. It was incubating its religious transformation in those discussions where Emerson hosted in the parlor of his Concord home, right? So here, in places like Ohio, these huge revival gatherings were occurring where much religious fervor was being shared. These sort of charismatic speakers were whipping up and changing the religious life of the Midwest and the South primarily. And as I've said, it was much quieter, but just as radical in places like New England and the Transcendentalist movement. So, the year Hedges Club began in 1836, Emerson published his first book, which is called Nature. That became sort of the Transcendentalists' de facto charter statement. Now, its argument is that nature, as in the green world, or white world as we see today, reveals itself through nature, that is human nature. Okay? So soul is the medium of the world's self-communication. That first reading today from the Oversoul indicated this in many ways. But the most enduring insight of this book, Nature, is the critique Emerson mounts along the way. He says, because it's a critique of American religious culture to this point in American religious history. Our age is retrospective, he writes in the book's opening lines. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us, and not the history of theirs? So, famous words from Emerson. True authority, he's contending here, resides within. So much of what I had to say today in my sermon. Soul sees more truly than reason instructs, focusing on Enlightenment tradition, right? Or that tradition inculcates, religious tradition. The soul can sort of mediate between these two forms of thinking. So 1836 was an important year because it also saw the publication of books by Orestes Brownson and George Ripley. Ripley was Emerson's cousin, so it was sort of a family affair, Transcendentalism. Both were Unitarian ministers, and with Hedge and Emerson, they were founding club members, the Transcendental Club. Their books were also on the soul's sufficiency to know Christ's truth. Okay? So Bronson Alcott, a teacher and one of the few non-ministers among the nascent Transcendental Club, father of Louisa May, perhaps you've read Little Women. He also published the first volume of his Conversations with Children of the Gospels that year in 1836, where he argued, echoing Plato, that even children could be host to divine knowledge if only the right questions led them there, right? This was really radical stuff. People were responding to Alcott and saying, "You're crazy. Children can know God?" I said, "Yes, actually. Just ask them the right questions. They'll show you." It wasn't until Emerson addressed the gathering for the graduating class of the Harvard Divinity School on July 15th, 1838, however, that Transcendentalism began to really sort of stand apart from Unitarian tradition. So, the setting for that gathering was no accident. Harvard, by that time, had become a kind of stronghold of the Unitarian establishment. Earlier, in 1832, as I mentioned earlier, Emerson had withdrawn from the ministry. He was unable to mainly affirm the right of communion. Okay? Here, though, before a room of soon-to-be newly minted Unitarian preachers, he tied his ideas of the soul to a forceful critique of Unitarian Christianity. Okay? He writes, "Men have come to speak of the revelation as somewhat long ago, given and done, as if God were dead." Okay? He declared these words in a way that the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, if you're familiar with him, cribbed them straight out of Emerson nearly half a century later. When we hear that term, God is dead, that's Emerson. That's not Nietzsche. Okay? That's Nietzsche appropriating Emerson. Okay. "The injury to faith," he says, "throttles the preacher, and the goodliest of institutions becomes an uncertain and inarticulate voice." So in place of the church, Emerson set the soul's own authority, right? In place of reason, he deputized intuition. It was a sort of seeing as only the soul inclines. So going sort of deeper into what helped to form Emerson's thinking. The English Romantics and the tradition of German Bildung helped clear a path for Emerson's 1838 Divinity School address, which I should say, this is in Divinity Hall. This is Emerson Chapel in Divinity Hall. It still looks like this today, thank goodness. We've not changed it yet.
Right by where Barbara's daughter lives.
Oh, really?
Yeah, right across from Labyrinth, Museum Street.
Wonderful. So it is just like this, and it's hard to believe that there were just 6 members of that graduating class. This address, which changed the complexion of American religiosity, was delivered to 6 graduating members. It caused a terrible stir among the Harvard faculty, and it happened right here. So, on to some of Emerson's influence. It was Thomas Carlyle, who I have pictured here, the English critic and historian who gave Emerson his clearest literary cue. Carlyle writes, and I have that quote up here. Sorry to navigate this with the microphone. I wish I had a third hand. "For each age, by the law of its nature, is different from every other age, and demands a different representation of this divine idea, the essence of which is the same in all, so that the literary man of one century is only by mediation and reinterpretation applicable to the wants of another." Now, what's he mean? For Emerson, Carlyle's demand was sharper than the Unitarian creed of self-culture, this sort of striving after Christ's perfection, which was so much the focus of Unitarian theology of their day. Emerson took Carlyle to mean that enacting the sort of needs of the historical moment requires embodying the times, right? As if to make a work of literature of our lives. "Life only avails," writes Emerson in his best-known essay, Self-Reliance, "not the having lived." So, Emerson, for his part, refused the sort of smooth, rationally expository style of Unitarian preaching in order to sort of put forth a voice that unsettled. Okay? "What have I to do with the sacredness of traditions if I live wholly from within?" he writes in Self-Reliance. He's more sort of inciting than inquiring. "If I am the devil's child, I will live from the devil. No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature." So aphorism here, sort of short, pithy claims, were Emerson's tool for breaking convention and sort of jolting the soul awake. This was, again, another sort of radical rhetorical move he was making. So direct, intuitive experience, life as a kind of literary event, became a kind of center of gravity for this movement in transcendentalism. After the town of Concord, the movement's other physical center of gravity was, unsurprisingly, a bookstore, specifically Boston's West Street bookstore, which was run by Elizabeth Peabody, where lectures were hosted, books were circulated, and the Transcendentalist periodical, The Dial, was published and sold. Okay? There's still a bookstore here. I'm glad to say it was featured in the film The Holdovers, which came out last year, I believe. You can, of course, also visit Emerson's home just down the street in Concord. I would encourage you to do that. You can take a tour for $10. It's the best $10 you can spend, and you can't get a sandwich in Concord for $10 these days. The movement's finest poet, Jones Very, who I have pictured here, he declared the age of epic poetry over so that America might discover its own voice. He's likewise remembered for these sonnets that demonstrate what a faith in intuition, this sort of spirit of the times that Emerson came proclaiming, what that faith might look like when it's carried to its furthest extreme. More than a poetry of insight, though, Transcendentalism is also known as a philosophy. The transcendent, in its name, harkens back to the 18th century German thinker Immanuel Kant. So Kant said, famously, that we never know things as they are in themselves, right? Only as they appear to our mentally structuring forms. Through the English romantic Samuel Taylor Coleridge's misreading of Kant, the opposite lesson of Kant's thinking filtered down to the transcendentalists. That is, that the soul could access reality unmediated, not through the concepts that we bring to understand reality, but we can actually get at the thing itself. Okay? So, Emerson's famous transparent eyeball passage in Nature. You might be familiar with this when he says, I'm crossing a bare New England common. I look to the sky and I am transformed into a transparent eyeball. The being of the universal currents circulate through me, and I see and I am all. Right? It's a sort of Coleridgean Kantianism. This passage in Nature is the classic instance of a sort of confused Kantianism. Okay? Transcendentalism gets off the ground due to Coleridge getting Kant wrong. It's really fascinating. So, Alcott and Margaret Fuller, who's another key figure in Transcendentalist history, make the same error when they treat the intuition as a sort of higher faculty of transcendent insight. What for Kant was a kind of break on the sort of grandiosity of what human beings could know, in mid-19th century New England becomes a sort of license for it. Okay? But the truer philosophical... Well, I'm not going to say that. You don't want to know more about Kant. Okay. This sort of cashes out in this concept of Emerson's that true authority arises only from what the subject avows. I spoke on this today, okay? Otherwise, he says, we're conformists who just sort of parrot the ideas of the previous generation and those around us, okay? So Theodore Parker, a crucial figure in Transcendentalist history, pressed this point in theological terms. He argues that true religion rests on the activity of the conscience, not inherited church creeds. Okay? So rather than being passive recipients, the subject, the individual, should constitute itself by its acts, should speak what it believes. You hear this idea echoed in what I had to say today. So the acts to reconcile thought with reality is politics, the transcendentalists teach finally. So that to this end, so I've gone through the literature, the philosophy, the religion, now the politics of transcendentalism. To this end, Emerson's cousin, George Ripley, founded the utopian community Brook Farm in West Roxbury in 1841. You can go there as well today. And he did this to cultivate a society where intellectual and manual labor would reinforce rather than undermine one another. Now, Alcott, too, attempted a similar experiment at Fruitlands, which is a farm in Harvard, Massachusetts, where Ada and I live, not at the farm in Harvard. And the movement to abolish slavery especially compelled the transcendentalists, to sort of image these communities that were truer to freedom than were legally allowed. Okay? So both these utopian experiments failed when their radical visions for the integration of labor and intellectual ideals couldn't be sustainably implemented. It's very complicated the ways in which they did fail, but the sort of bumper sticker lesson from these communities was you can't eat your ideals. So, if Brook Farm and Fruitlands exposed the limits of transcendentalism in practice, the movement's political legacy has endured in the writings of its most compelling moral figures. And this is where I'll end, because these might be the figures you know best. First, on this slide I have pictured is Margaret Fuller. She was editor of The Dial, and author of Woman in the 19th Century. Fuller curated transcendentalism's public voice and gave the age its most important statement on women's equality. So taking those ideals of transcendentalism and putting them into action in the world. Fuller, I should say, we learned recently that the filmmaker Richard Linklater is going to make a film about her life. That's going to be shot in the next, beginning in the next few months, I assume, and here in Boston somewhere. I hope in Concord. Natalie Portman is going to be playing Margaret Fuller. So we've got some bright stars that are going to be coming out for this story. Ethan Hawke is going to be Emerson. So get excited. Of course, you may also know perhaps the best known transcendentalists, Henry David Thoreau, who has come to embody transcendentalism spirit most completely in the American consciousness, I'd say. So his aim was not so much to reject the project of political reform as to make it a kind of personal quest. Okay? So after building a cabin at Walden Pond on land of Emerson's, he lived there alone, not far from here, for 2 years, from 1845 to 1847, in an experiment of radical simplicity and deliberateness. So the political dimension of Thoreau's experiment cannot be overstated, especially his abolitionist commitments, okay? The freedom he pursued in Walden Woods amplified its absence, the absence of freedom in America, he believed. So he writes, "If you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be." Before he enjoins, "Now put the foundations under them." So he goes to the woods to put the foundations under his ideals, to live out the transcendentalist ethos. Okay? So the fact that Thoreau's Walden stands as the most successful of transcendentalism's experiments witnesses to both the movement's limits and lasting promise, I think. So it's a limit because it's religion of independence, it's literature of direct experience, its philosophy of self, and its politics of reform have so far only been realized in a community of one. Okay? But it holds this promise because, like the ideal of America itself, the fullest possibility transcendentalism heralds really remains to be tried. Okay? So, I'll lose my screen right as we get into the discussion. So we might broadly conceive of transcendentalism as a response, as I said during my sermon, to the modern crisis of authority. What in Europe emerged due to the slow erosion of traditional forms, the ways in which Enlightenment rationality sort of took over traditional forms of reasoning, it arrived in the United States as a kind of demand for epistemic knowledge and moral legitimacy. So the transcendentalist insistence over the authority of conscience and direct experience was a rebellion, as I've been saying, against New England's church establishment. But more generally, it sought an answer to the larger question of how modern people might believe and act in the absence of external guarantees. If that sounds abstract, it's because transcendentalism is less a set of conclusions than a sort of discipline of where we locate the sources of our knowing and our willing. Okay, and this is where we come back round to AI. Okay? What I was explaining was that AI is not just a tool for finding information. It's an accelerating cultural habit of deferring judgment. That is, by treating knowledge as something we can receive ready-made without the inward labor of weaving that knowledge into the lives we lead. And that's exactly why I described AI this morning as a sort of crisis of authority. Okay? The danger is not that machines will think, that they will think instead of us. It's that we'll stop practicing the kind of accountable selfhood by which our beliefs become more than mere sort of outputs. Okay? Our beliefs, our commitments to certain things we take to be true, should be counted as something that's uniquely ours. They should be lived out. They should be answerable to our conscience. Okay? So Emerson names with particular force this idea in his Divinity School address. His complaint there isn't simply that churches get doctrine wrong, but they encourage a religion of hearsay, he says. Churches in Emerson's day practice a faith too mediated by tradition, by secondhand testimony, and institutional authority, rather than revelation as a sort of a living possibility for us. When Emerson says, in effect, that we treat God as if God were dead, he means the deepest sources of moral and spiritual insight can't be outsourced without damaging the soul. Okay? So I might sharpen my sermon's claim then by saying that AI is spiritually and ethically corrosive when it functions like the sort of authority that Emerson railed against in his Divinity School address. Okay? Powerful as it is, AI's fluency, its speed, and its, let's say, statistical reach has seduced us into treating this tool, artificial intelligence, as an unimpeachable authority, rather than as one more instrument that must be governed by our conscience. Okay? So for Emerson, the question is never, is this information impressive? If you've used AI, it's extremely impressive. Extremely. We cannot downplay this. But the better question, Emerson says, or Emerson thinks, I think, is, does this make us more awake, more responsible, and more capable of affirming for myself what is true? Okay? So here's a way into discussion, I think, and I've got some questions up on the screen. Where in your own life do you notice AI helping you extend the adventure of knowing And where do you notice it tempting you to evade that adventure? Okay? As I said in the sermon today, AI is not going anywhere. We don't do anybody any good by burying our heads in the sand and saying, I'm just not going to use this, or I'm just going to pretend like it doesn't exist. Plenty of people are doing this. That sort of response prevents us from actually dealing with the world that we encounter. Okay? So, how is it helping you to extend the adventure of knowing? And where do you notice it tempting you to evade that adventure? What kinds of questions or decisions or relationships feel most at risk of becoming religion by tradition all over again? In Emerson's words, right? Only now we have this new mediator. It used to be, say, the church tradition. It used to be a sort of corrupt politics. Well, sometimes, let's be honest, it can still be that. But Emerson says, remove those things. What do you think? Don't tell me what society thinks. Don't tell me what tradition thinks. Don't tell me what you've been told to think. What do you think? We've replaced many of the things that Emerson came to sort of pull away from our field of vision with one of the most incredible powers that the world has ever known. And conversely, what practices might we adopt personally or as a congregation, as citizens, importantly, that keep AI in a supplemental role while preserving the work transcendentalism asks of us? So the work of becoming persons who can say, this is what I believe, and here are the reasons I'm willing to stand behind it. Okay? So these are some questions.
We have about 20 minutes. Yeah, 20 minutes. Feel free if you need to head out before then, but I think we'll aim for 20 more minutes for conversation.
Why don't we start with 4 or 5 minutes taking whatever of these questions are sparking your thinking right now, just speaking with somebody nearby, okay? And then we'll come back together and share out and have a larger discussion all together. Does that sound okay? All right, go ahead.
So, I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to give us all an opportunity to come back together to share out as a community. So let's.
Thank you. So maybe I'll pass around the microphone and we can share some ideas. So let's just go ahead and share out with wherever we found ourselves. How you're noticing AI either helping you to extend the adventure of knowing or otherwise evading it. What feels most at risk by this sort of new form of mediation between us and what we affirm to be true in the sort of Emersonian sense. And finally, what practices that you're adopting that maybe are helpful or less helpful in our new reality of living with this technology. Anyone want to get us started?
I sort of find AI sort of passive learning. You just get the facts. And AI is now interpreting my emails. And it's so interesting to see all the nuances go. I just read what I wrote and they explain it. And I find this church is really helpful here because we don't have a creed that we believe. We can believe whatever we have come to within ourselves, and we have it's a covenant, which is so generous and so big. And also the Buddhist practice that I have been part of wants us not to take things, even Buddhist things, by belief. We have to experience in order to come to those. And those are the practices that I have found very helpful. This church and Buddhism.
I'll try and put this into words. I'm just, the what if I bring with, does AI, this is a better question, does AI check the fact that what I'm bringing is actually prejudice and bad thoughts and negativism? And so here I am, this free-thinking person, but I'm not bringing moral myself. Does AI in any way correct that or play a factor with that?
Russ, we had one over here.
Sure.
Yeah. I guess this may be a related question, I don't know, but we were talking about, and I've been thinking about, I hearken back to what you said about Emerson's, the statement about the devil. You have to repeat it exactly, but, and I was wondering even then, did Emerson curate what he took in based on whether he thought it was coming from the devil or coming from, how did he make those distinctions himself? And now with AI, it becomes even harder. And we were talking about the harm, and we were saying that there's a lot of harm coming, to the environment and so forth, in conjunction with AI and the ability to expand it. And it just becomes so much more complicated to make that curation of what to take in to maintain any kind of purity of thought and morality of the soul, and how you make that. And it's not just whether you believe what AI tells you or not. It's bigger than that. It's maybe, first of all, the existence in terms of what it's doing to our world, and how you interact from that place. I don't know if it's mostly question I'm putting out here.
Just wanted to add on that, thank you. I find myself looking at these questions and thinking they're such great questions, and I'm so glad we're talking about it. I can't even get there because for me, I with deep respect disagree. I think for me personally, I refuse to use AI. I will not touch it. I have it turned off everywhere you can turn it off. And I think for me it's because I can't engage in creating a practice of how to use it in a healthy supplemental way while it is doing such deep harm to the environment, to individuals, to society's concept of truth, the total dearth of regulation. I mean, I can go on and on. I have a whole spiel I can do, and I won't. But for me, I would love to be able to get there, but I can't get there until that harm is addressed and there are regulations and strict guidelines that just don't exist yet for it to be, for me, a moral decision for me to engage with generative AI.
Keep going around here.
Sure, I feel like you've heard enough from me, so I have lots to say, but let's get more.
We have
voices
lots
in.
of folks
It's
who are
helpful.
eager to
Yeah,
speak.
please,
Yeah, we'll go Amanda and then Joan.
Just, you know, as I was listening to your great talk, thank you. Sometimes like wordplay pops into my head, and you know, you were talking about AI and hearsay, and then the word heresy popped into my mind. You know, worshiping false idols, and then it brings me back to Brook Farm and Fruitlands, and then the experiment of this nation, and you know, you were saying you can't eat ideals, and it just seems like outsourcing our sustenance will always lead to corruption or immorality, and then I thought of what you were saying about your father and the tomatoes, and so it just seems like only by doing, like the Shakers, you know, only by doing can we avoid those pitfalls. That's all.
The thing that disturbs me the most about AI is the pseudo relationships. And Andy was talking about that with us, like that it engages you as if it were a person, and it's you know, and so you think you have a relation with it, but it's actually manipulating you, and it's in a very, I mean, it's a very it's creeping into my conversations. As you know, like the email chains, it jumps in with my friends and is starting to summarize my email conversations, and it's moving into my life. And you know, I know it wants to manipulate me, and so that's alarming. Although it's a great source of information for grandkids, you know.
So I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, so I'm sort of interested from that perspective, and there are a lot of kids out there who use AI for companionships and for therapy. And the idea, and AI is very alluring in that way. It's very engaging. And my worry is that for a lot of kids, it's taking the place of a relationship. You know, there's a lot of loneliness out there, and we're providing them now with these AI therapists to somehow alleviate that, but it's not really substantive. So that's my concern.
Barbara.
I was working on a letter yesterday that meant a lot to me, to a person I care about a lot. And Copilot was jumping in. And what they were doing was turning it into a generic letter. My soul, myself, was going out of it. And it could have been sent pretty much by anybody to anybody. And that's disturbing.
We have someone with the microphone here.
So I'm really just so fascinated by this whole conversation, and thank you very much. I'm thinking about the conversation as a parent, a human, parent of adolescents, and someone who's worked within high-performing schools for a number of different decades as a school counselor. And what really strikes me is my whole educational ethos has been learning through doing. You know, starting my career working with adolescents in backpacking programs. And what really strikes me is I work at a high-powered suburban public school, not far from here. And the essential elements of what students need to learn have to do with creativity, curiosity, working in groups, and what I'm finding, and I don't have, in fact, I have so many more questions than answers. What I'm finding is that the pieces of technology and the cell phone, social media, like that was what we gave our kids years ago, this sort of smoking gun. And now I'm seeing this again, and we're not going back to the blue books. And I don't know how to structure I don't know how to structure education. I've worked in education for decades, and I don't know how to structure education in a large, high-performing public school anymore because we don't have the capacity to work in groups. I'm really someone who's committed to working in schools and public school, and I don't know how to do it within a public school. So, anyway, there's a lot. Well, I think it's a lot easier in an independent school, having started my career in an independent schools, because you actually have a mission statement. You have generally much smaller classes. You can say, this is what we believe, this is what we value. It is much more performative in a public school because you don't have an admission process. So anyway, I've taken up a lot of airtime, but I'm like writing down, I've got to go back and I was an English major, I've got to go back and read all, because we can't go back to the blue books. And that's what a lot of the teachers are saying. Oh, well, just go back to the blue books. I'm like, can't go back to the blue books. So anyway, thank you so much for this discussion.
So, looking at that last sentence, the work of becoming persons who can say, this is what I believe. This is what I believe, and here are the reasons why I'm willing to stand behind it. I feel like that is getting relinquished. We're saying, this is what AI is telling me to believe. This is what AI says. So that it feels, I worry we're losing that. I mean, maybe we're not, because as you say, this is here. This isn't something we can avoid. And is that being taken? Are we allowing this to be taken away from us?
I was just furiously writing down things while you were giving your sermon, and one of the things was we have to live the knowledge we possess. So we get this information from AI, but then using it, living it, trying it out, seeing where it takes you. And it reminded me a little of high school. We were just saying that being in high school, we had to memorize a lot of information. And now I see all that information I had to memorize. I've lived it and I understand it in a whole nother level. So it's kind of like that. You're given the facts, but then you really have to live it.
If I could just quickly say just one quick comment. One thing we haven't mentioned is how effective it is to be wrong.
Yeah.
And to not know something. From my father, I should say, my father lives in Las Vegas. It's impossible to grow good tomatoes in Las Vegas. He keeps and keeps and keeps trying, and he knows so much as a result of it. Nate mentioned, I was lost in divinity school. I only feel a little bit found as a result of having been lost. When I teach students now, they don't like being wrong because they know they can go right to where answers are. That they are resistant to this experience of being wrong. It's crucial to our experience of learning things, and we are externalizing it from the education process.
That's factually wrong, but what about morally wrong? I'm like Sarah, trying to avoid AI actually, and I'm very annoyed that it's summarizing my emails for me now. I do try as much as possible to use it as a supplement, for example, if I'm trying to find the meaning of some word I've come across in a crossword or something. But for me, what's most important in my spiritual life is learning to live in the present. And somehow AI doesn't help me with that. It's definitely a spiritual pursuit, and I don't find there's anything in that realm that can help me find my own soul.
You might have touched on this, but I was just curious, is there any way to get AI to help further analytical and critical thinking and discernment? Because that seems to have been missing or on the decline, and with AI it seems like it's just going to go out the window. And so I think it would be really interesting if AI could somehow further that instead of dampen it.
my sense is, and educators in the room could speak to this as well, I think many schools and districts across the country are sort of giving into the idea that this technology cannot be kept out of the classroom, especially in public school settings, and are thinking exactly along these lines. How can we use it as a tool? How can we use it to help students deepen their critical intellectual pursuits rather than just farming out those pursuits to this tool that can do it for them? If I had 10 lives to live, I think I would devote one to figuring out this conundrum, because it seems like it. Right. Again, well, and something that's not talked about a lot in debates over AI is it's been trained on what we've learned over thousands of years. It's old knowledge. It's not new. It doesn't make new things until we figure out how to get to that point of singularity where it is making new things. Then we might be in trouble. But when we sort of are derelict in our own responsibility to think creatively, we're just passing around things we already know. It's sort of microwaved knowledge, right?
Let's do Colleen first and then Becca. Sorry.
I think can you hear me? Yes. I think that in general, as a culture, we embrace new things, and then only later do we we embrace them looking at the positive aspects, and only later, after time has given us the experience with that new thing, do we look at the negative aspects. Television is a wonderful example. It was seen as, marvelous, and kids had TVs in their rooms, and now it's like, oh, no. If you're thinking, you're not doing that. Social media is another example, and now AI is another example. I think it's really important as a culture, when something new comes up, no matter what it is, for us to pay attention to what the negative aspects are. In terms of practicality, I think that's a really difficult question for numerous reasons, which I won't go into, but I do think that the ancient idea of Sabbath is really useful. That is, taking a time where you have no media in that day. You have no email, you have no text, you have no TV. You just have books or live relationship with people. That might be a good practice to promote, and something might come out of that.
So as an educator in a high-achieving district also, I have some concerns. I work with middle school students, and I have some concerns that my district is jumping on the AI integration bus without some of these questions and some really deep thinking. And I mean, if I'm being honest, I do see some places where it can help. I take an assignment that I'm giving students and I put it in Magic School, and I put in a student's learning profile, and in 20 seconds, I have a far more accessible assignment for that child that is in front of me. It would have taken me an hour, 2 hours to create that more accessible assignment for that student. So there are really thoughtful, helpful ways to use it as a tool. My worry is about that crisis of authority where we're abdicating our responsibility and our thinking, and it's eroding our ability to listen to that inner voice, to listen to what we believe, and students don't have the opportunity to figure out what they believe when all they want to do is just Google search or Chat GPT the answer to any question they're given in a room. So it's so complicated, and it's taking up a lot of my brain space right now.
Just noticing we're past 12:30, Russ, and if it's okay with you, maybe just a few more comments. We'll go Ben, and then gentleman in the back, and maybe one more.
So I have two comments, and I'm not sure which one to say, so I'll say them both. The first is that we have to be careful not to put AI up as one word covers everything. If I go to a foreign country and I can take out my phone and hold it up and read the Chinese script in real time, hey, that's great. I don't see a problem with that. If the AI is being used to generate spam that's flooding the zone and convincing people that vaccines are a bad idea, that's a terrible use. The other thing I was going to say is that you talked a lot about what's true and how do we make sense of what's correct. That's what's broken to me. And AI is involved, but to me the thing that really troubles me is that we don't know how to say what's true.
Yeah, thank you. So if I understand correctly, the main thesis here was that given this technology, we still have to use our brains. And I think that's the case, has been the case for centuries. Like, given technology of books, we still have to use the brains. Like, you don't learn how to grow tomatoes from reading books about tomatoes. The same thing applies to any technology we have. One thing I want to comment on is somebody mentioned that it's a passive form of learning. I actually find it somewhat different. So I use the technology quite a lot, and I find it actually sort of the opposite, being actually very active way of learning. I use it as a tutor to teach me things in an endlessly patient and non-judgmental ways that I can ask questions, explain this to me this way, explain this to me that way. I still don't get it. Can you find a metaphor? And you can, just in the last few months, I've used it to enhance my understanding of multiple domains that I would not have otherwise been able to access. Because if I read a book, I only get one perspective. I cannot ask the book a question. Imagine you have a tutor in, I'm a nerd, so it's like I had one of the topics was, something in math, and another one was in some other domain. I can use this technology to sort of enhance my understanding by saying what I think and ask it to comment on it. Hey, can you explain this to me? Why am I wrong? So in that way, I think it's much more active form of learning than anything we previously had. The only way to actually compare it would be to have a personal tutor that has a high, high educational degree in any of the topics you have. Who can afford that? Who can afford to have a tutor in, number theory and physics and transcendentalism and something like this? This technology makes it a lot more accessible in that way. And it also knows, because of interaction with you, it knows your personal profile. Let's say I'm a visual learner. I would like the words on the page. I would like to have general statement versus examples. It remembers my preferences, and it tailors the specific ways of it that I get to interact and learn from it to that. So I feel just like with any technology, you have to learn how to use it. And please, you still have to use our brains to know what is true and not. But the technology enables it for sure.
I think we'll go to Sarah for what might be our last comment.
That's too bad. All I'd like to do is call attention to Caroline Smart's prayer. I just thought that it was beautiful, and there's something about the process she talked about, that she's darning the socks. She could have gone to Amazon. She could have gone to AI. I thought that was beautiful.
I want to thank everybody for sticking around. No solutions have been arrived at, I don't think, but Russ, thank you so much for your presence with us and all your work in putting this together. Somebody asked Russ if it was okay to share your sermon through our next newsletter, just as a PDF. If that's okay with you, we'll do that. And I was thinking too, we might offer some sort of like just tech support if you are interested, right, in turning off the AI on your email or something like that. That's absolutely something that we can be here to guide you through. And I know it was just there, right? We didn't really have an option to opt into it, I don't think. So we'll work on offering that as well. But what a wonderful chance for us to think about this as a church, and I'm sure we will have further conversations. So thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Thanks again to Russ.